again, Gareth here, and welcome back to the second part of the Discover How to Get Fluent language course. In the first session, I asked you to go away and think about why you want to learn your language. You're back, so I take it you've got good reasons. And if we want to keep that motivation going, you want to feel that you're actually making rapid progress early on. This session is all about focusing on the essentials that are going to get you up and running in your language without wasting time, without getting distracted on things which are nice to have, but aren't the core. Let's go. In order to make rapid and solid initial progress, there are two main areas that you need to focus on in your new language. The first are the fundamental language patterns. These occur again and again in different sentences. There may be 150, 200 of them at most. You could call it grammar, but grammar is something abstract, analytical. It's useful to learn that later on when you're digging deeper into your language. But grammar rules are not things you can apply on the wing. You can, however, run with sentence patterns. So those are one of the things you need to focus on. For example, comparing size. The palace is bigger than the house. That sort of pattern, you can slot different items in, different nouns in. I went yesterday, I will go tomorrow. Tenses, again, you can slot in different verbs, different times to get the same idea. I went a year ago, I will go in a year's time. And so on. And then the core vocabulary. As a rough rule of thumb, we can look at frequency in order to select the most important words. And it's always the case in general text that a huge chunk of what you're exposed to will be made up of maybe 100 or so top functional words which occur again and again and again. Everybody has to know them. The same with the next 500 to 700 most frequent words that can take you to well over half of any typical everyday conversational text. So we need to focus on those first, and then we can build up. By the time you've got to the most frequent 1,000 words, you've covered 75% of a normal text. And then take it up again to 2,000, you can see diminishing returns are setting in, but you're then up to 85% of a normal text. Then you can start to flesh out with the vocabulary in the particular areas that are interesting to you because of your hobbies or your work requirements, whatever your needs are. So you need to focus on the fundamental patterns and the core vocabulary. But you always need to learn in context. With vocabulary, we talk about collocations and chunking. This is jargon, but what it basically means is words which go together. For example, we talk about sitting an exam or taking an exam. We don't stand an exam in English, sefyll arholiad, which is the way you say it in Welsh. Eine Prüfung ablegen, sagt man auf Deutsch. Chunking is then chunks of sentences, a bit longer than a collocation, which is usually a couple of words. And chunking is actually how the scientists think that we speak. We manipulate chunks of language. So learn vocabulary in context, learn collocations, learn chunks of vocabulary, and try and think about the underlying ideas. Use images in your head to help you to remember. That's your core. The other essential when you're starting out is the sound of the language. This is an exciting journey into a new soundscape. You've got to tune your ear because each language has new sounds that you won't be used to in yours. Don't neglect that pronunciation section at the beginning of your book. Work with a teacher or language partner at the start. And don't neglect intonation within a word, within a sentence, or tones, which are important in some languages such as Chinese or Thai. Accent, also important. But the key thing is, you don't want to disguise where you've come from. You don't want to give up your background, unless you want to work as a spy. The key is simply, you want to be understood. so that people won't switch to English. Now, there are tools available to help you with this. The pronunciation section of your textbook I've mentioned, and also online you can find sites and you can find courses to purchase which will help you. You can also work with your tutor or pronunciation trainer on accent pronunciation, on getting used to the soundscape of the language. Another thing you can do to help tune in your ear is to identify a source of passive listening exposure, radio, podcast, or other recordings that you can listen to at normal speed just to get used to the music of the language, the rhythms, and don't worry that you don't understand anything at the beginning. What about reading and writing in the language? Well, we know, of course, that reading and writing came later in history, and they come later for kids too. That tells us something. They're not the essence of language. Yet, of course, we're likely to want to become sophisticated users of our language, and as adult speakers, we're going to want to read and to write. So I don't want to undervalue these skills. The question is how much emphasis we place on them at which stage of the learning process. Just remember that reading and writing can be a distraction at the beginning, particularly if the different values attached to letters in your language are carried over into the new language. So don't let literacy get in the way of tuning in your ear. If you're learning a language like German or French or Spanish, which uses Latin alphabet just like we do, learn the names of the letters so that things can be spelled out for you. And learn when the sound values differ from those in English. Focus in on the differences rather than the similarities. What about if your language uses a different writing system? Well, it may be another alphabet built on exactly the same principles as ours, as in Russian or Greek, or a more exotic language such as Georgian, for example. There I suggest you dive straight in, because the fact is you can learn these alphabets in a couple of afternoons. You will find it much, much slower as you start to read, because you're going to have to learn to read again, in effect. But the principles are the same, and you can learn to decipher signs and so on remarkably quickly. However, what if the system is different altogether? Now, it could be that it's a script which just gives you the consonants, as in Arabic or Hebrew. Each symbol could be a consonant and a vowel, as in the Devanagari script used for many Indian languages, or Amharic in Ethiopia. It could be that the symbols express syllables, as in the kanya in Japanese, which in that language are combined with the logographic kanji, the characters which are based on the Chinese. And with those and with Chinese characters in Mandarin, of course, it's an underlying idea rather than the sound which is expressed by the character. These systems, being different, are going to take longer to master, particularly in the case of logographic systems such as the Chinese. So generally the advice that's out there is it's better to get basic conversational skills first, unless of course your aim and your need is primarily just reading, before you move on to undertake the writing. Most of us starting a language want to get conversing as quickly as possible. So one of the early things you need to do is to develop a portfolio of typical initial conversational subjects. Learn how to talk about yourself a bit, about your family. To talk about and to ask about where you or the person you're speaking to is from. Your living arrangements. Your work, hobbies and interests. Your reasons for learning the language. All the sorts of things which typically come up when anybody gets to know somebody new. And any further personal, specialist, survival topics that you're going to need because of the context in which you will be using the language in the early stages. Work on those early on, pull them out of your textbook, work on them with a teacher, with a language exchange partner. There's another type of phrase which is really important to learn at the beginning, something that I call toolkit phrases, something that's often neglected. These are phrases in the target language which will help you to use that language to learn more. The most important one is, how do you say X in your language? You can point at a cup of coffee. You can point at your computer and say, how do you say internet connection in your language? That sort of thing. Another important phrase I'm afraid you're going to need at the beginning is, could you please repeat that? Another, could you please speak more slowly? And then, if they switch to English, which can happen quite a lot at the beginning, you've got to be determined. Please speak your language. I really want to learn it. Often you find that people are delighted and keen to encourage you, if the context is right, to learn their language. Work on how to say these things with your teacher and exchange partner in your early meetings. Those are the toolkit phrases, but what about the actual kit? The key thing, I think, is a good textbook. A good textbook can provide an overview for you and a framework. What you need to look out for is a pronunciation section, an introduction to the most frequent vocabulary, often in different common life scenarios. And I think you want a textbook which covers all the main structures of the language in one or in several volumes, which can then get pricier. You don't want one that just takes you part way into the language, isn't part of a series, and then leaves you hanging, as I have found with a couple actually, the Basque textbooks that I'm using. And it's great as well if your textbook has answers to the exercises that are in it, so that you can self-control to an extent, and audio. Whether it comes with a CD or there's an MP3 online that you can access. That also really helps for self-study. As for further kit, a good two-way dictionary is a great idea. Whether it's on your phone, online, or a physical dictionary. It's going to empower you. Get one with pronunciation and with examples of usage so that you're always learning again in context. A lot of learners like to have a notebook to hand too, for jotting down new words and phrases learned, or things that come to mind that you can't say yet that you want to ask your teacher about. You may notice interesting uses of the language on signs when you're out and about in the country. You may want to illustrate in the margins. Get creative. But have a nice record, a diary even, of your learning progress. And finally, don't neglect the fun. Have a bank of relaxing things that you can do in the language when you don't feel like studying anymore or working with a tutor. Ideally, it would be the sort of thing you like to do in your own language, whether it's YouTube videos or comic books, magazines to flick through. If you're a cook, it could be recipes in the language. Anything that just doesn't feel like work. And don't forget background songs and music in this context. They can be a great way to attune you, literally, to the language. That then is the roadmap for the first stages of your language learning journey, mastering the core. Your task for today is to go away to your local bookshop or to get online and choose yourself a textbook. Remember some of the key features I mentioned in the talk. You want some audio, you want quite a comprehensive book as regards structures, and you want one which has self-correcting exercises in it. This is going to provide you with a framework to work on your own or with a teacher or an exchange partner in the early stages of language learning. Tomorrow, we're going to look at some of the tips which experienced language learners would always want to give when it comes to how to go about learning. They're based on insights from cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and if you use them, they're going to make the time you spend learning your language that much more effective. See you next time.